Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming along to this session of Daring Cities. There are people still being admitted into the session, so I'll give a little bit of background and that will enable them time to join us. But look, welcome to ICLEI Daring Cities. This program has been going for over 2 weeks now. We actually kicked off way back on the 7th of October. And we're into the final lap now. This program finishes on Wednesday. And you probably are aware that the Daring Cities theme is that while we're all grappling with the pandemic, we also have to deal with the climate emergency. And the session is very much about how we can address climate change as a matter of urgency while also managing the pandemic. Different parts of the world are up to very different stages in wave 1, wave 2 of the pandemic, just as I guess we're all experiencing climate change in different ways and tackling it in our own way. It's traditional when we run these sessions to acknowledge the traditional owners, particularly as we're anchoring this show from Australia. And so I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the Melbourne area in Australia. And we all pay respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Kulin Nation in our case, but also we respect other Indigenous peoples from the other parts of the world represented here. This is actually part 2 of the climate governance risk sessions. You may be aware, you might have attended last week. We had a very informative session put on by Donovan Burton on the importance of assessing the risk to local government operations and governance posed by climate change and to building climate governance risk into all of our planning and all of our policies. Last week was very much an information session. We had a little bit of feedback from 2 local governments which have been using this tool. But this week will be a much more interactive session where Donovan is again going to take us through a guide on how to develop a climate risk, climate change policy or perhaps a corporate standard for your organisation. This session is certainly targeted at local governments, but we think it will be equally relevant to other authorities, other agencies, particularly agencies owned by levels of government for developing your climate risk approach. Today will be quite interactive. It will be run by Donovan, who I'll introduce in a moment. A fair part of the session will be Donovan walking us through each step of the process, the recommended process for developing a policy, but he will pause quite a number of times at the end of every section, beg your pardon, and then we'll handle questions. So what we'd invite you to do is, as Donovan's speaking, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat function on the bottom of your panel there. And then when we pause, we'll have a look at the chats and you can actually ask your question live, or if you prefer, we can read out your question. So that will take a fair part of the hour. And towards the end, if time allows, we'll have an additional Q&A session. But we think most of the answers will have been delivered throughout. So our presenter today is Mr. Donovan Burton. Donovan is the principal of Informed.City, which is it's a climate tech firm. Donovan is the climate change governance specialist and he's the director of Informed.City. And recently Informed.City and ICLEI have partnered up because we see this approach as being a very important part of the repertoire of tools that we want to be able to offer to cities which have signed up to the Global Covenant of Mayors or in other ways are tackling climate change. So Informed.City and Donovan Burton are partnering with ICLEI in this. Donovan has worked throughout the Asia Pacific region. Over quite a number of years, he's carried out more than 400 climate change governance assessments. Donovan believes that understanding governance is a key to mainstreaming organisational responses to climate change. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Donovan and he'll run us through. As I say, several times during the session, we'll pause, we'll have a look at the questions in the chat function and do our best to respond to those. So I think that's all we need to tell you at the start. There'll be a little bit of a wrap up at the end as well, and we'll tell you how you can follow up this approach if you're interested, how you can contact us, and we'll give you a little bit more information about the rest of the Daring Cities program. But now it's my pleasure to hand over to Donovan. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever this finds you. Today I'm in sunny, well, not so sunny Brisbane. I'm just going to share my screen. Luckily, we've had some severe weather warnings out for this afternoon, but I think we're okay today. Tomorrow they're anticipating tennis ball size hail, so I think we're going to be in for a significant weather event. So today I'm just going to, and as Steve said, this will be, you know, we'll make it as interactive as we can on a video platform. But today I'll be talking through how to create, or how I think, you know, organisations should create a climate change policy or a corporate standard. It's something that I think is really important, and it helps robust decision making. Sorry, I'm just going to get to my slides. Just have to put that caveat out first, that this is, I always remind listeners to go out and seek their detailed advice if they're going to create their climate change policy, and we'll leave it at that. So drawing on from last week, but for those of you that didn't attend last week, I think it's fair to say that most people in the room would know that climate change is it's a systems risk, and it's really, really complex. And responding to climate change risk using mitigation, reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, responding to those transition and physical risks, is challenging, and it's quite difficult to do in a sort of I guess, one adaptation plan, for want of a better word. And so because of the systems risk, and because of the complexity and the rapidly moving rate of climate change and the cascading impacts, a climate change policy, I think, adds significant amount of value for any organisation, and it doesn't need to be big, but I think it's really important to have. And usually the question arises is, why did somebody in an organisation do something this way? I've got a colleague, and he's a lawyer, and he said that he used to be a litigant lawyer, and he was often had local government or state government employees on the other side of the bench, and he would ask them that question, why did you do it this way? And he loved it. He loved asking that question, because usually the answer was, I don't know. And that's because, embedded processes have happened. Sometimes people are just doing research for themselves. There was no consistent approach. And what I tend to remind any participant is that if you're ever unsure about what or how, or whether you need to have a policy for this, always say your honour at the end of every question. So if you ask yourself a question, why am I doing this? Just think of yourself at the other end of a royal commission, or if you're in court. And in Australia, when we have large events such as the recent bushfire events, we then have royal commissions. And local government employees get grilled about why they're making certain decisions, and usually they're not quite sure why they made that decision. It might have been because somebody told them, but there's no sort of decision pathway. And that's why I think actually having a climate change policy or a corporate standard will help you navigate this process. And in Australia, that gives you some level of defence as well around liability risk as well. So the climate change policy allows an organisation to place that climate change lens over all of the organisation's existing systems. So councils already have existing systems, governance systems. The policy just allows it to be consistent and ensure that it's not just consistent, that it is robust. A good example is I was working with a large municipality recently, and somebody in the asset management team was using 80 centimetres of sea level rise for their decision making, while somebody in the finance team was using 50 centimetres of sea level rise for their, long-term planning. And because it was such a large organisation, you had this inconsistent decision making going on, and so that was actually, makes things quite challenging, especially if you've got a large organisation. But at the same time, a climate change policy is usually outward facing as well. So it's usually public. So those in the private sector or your community can see what you are doing and why you're making certain decisions. So as I said before, it feeds into the core sort of governance framework of an organisation, and I've actually broken it up into these 4 themes because this follows the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's TCFD, and I really encourage anybody in the room, if they haven't heard of the TCFD, please Google TCFD, because it's a significant private sector disclosure mechanism that does have ramifications for municipalities, especially around insurance and lending risk. So for governance, it helps drive the decision making into corporate planning, financial planning, etc. It will help the organisation do consistent processes for quantifying their exposure, both for the council or their organisational assets and operations, but also for the wider community and the wider environment. It also ensures that there's a consistent approach for adaptation actions, identifying roles and responsibilities, and understanding, that collective community approach and what's the best mechanism for having a community approach. And then also it helps frame that emerging requirement around disclosure. So as I go back to that TCFD, as I was talking about, that's a voluntary mechanism that talks about the disclosure of risk and risk responses. But it's, I think, more likely than not for local governments and state agencies that will also become a mandatory, there'll be mandatory reporting requirements for climate change. So a good example of that is in New Zealand. So last month, the central government enacted their Climate Change Act, or some of the provisions under the Climate Change Act, which said that the minister can ask anybody to disclose information. And what the minister has done is said that all local governments and all utilities must respond to mandatory reporting questions. And a large number of private sector organisations, I think it's the top 300 or so, have to do mandatory disclosure of their climate change risks as well. So this climate change policy sort of helps feed into that, and it's an eventuality, I think, in most jurisdictions. So what I'll talk through today, we'll break it down to, we've done the context, we've got we'll start with the context, we'll do climate change scenarios, governance, capability, monitoring, and then talk about disclosure. And I'll stop after each of these and we can open it up for questions. So if we get the ball rolling, so what I'm going to be talking through is actually how does this policy look like. So let's start with the policy context. Usually you have a little bit of a fluff at the front end of a policy. And so I think the minimal elements of a climate change policy, and when I say climate change, it could be a combined climate change adaptation and mitigation policy, or it could be just be an adaptation policy. I've seen both in Australia and New Zealand. So of course you'd want to put it in those, the international context where you've got the trends, you've got the Paris Agreement. It's always important to put in the nested government regulations. So are there subordinate, legislation, or are there other legislation that they have to follow, like in New Zealand, where they have to follow the mandatory reporting or the Climate Change Act. This is always a good location for the organisation's risk summary. So if you have any information around what your risk is, it puts it into context, and also a general conversation around market forces. There's some significant market forces occurring in Australia and New Zealand. at the moment where lenders are looking at locations and changing their asset to loan ratio because of the climate change risk. So I think it's really important to think about those market forces. I just put a couple of examples up here. Won't read all of this, and this will be, this webinar will be available online at a later date, so you can read it there. This is just some examples of some councils who actually do have a climate change policy. So one of them was Kingborough Council, that's in Tasmania. Another council that has a publicly available policy for you to have a look at is Mackay Regional Council, that's in Queensland. But usually around the context, you have the objectives, and it just talks about ensuring that that climate change adaptation is a core component of planning for a more resilient council, etc., etc. And critically, just acknowledging that a systems approach or a collective approach needs to be undertaken. I was arguing last week that I think organisations should be allocating a significant proportion of their resources to mainstreaming climate change decision making, because still at the moment it's still hanging on the side, and it traditionally sits in the environment section of an organisation. And I think it's now time for climate change to sit within corporate governance or corporate risk, or at least report to corporate governance and corporate risk. So any questions yet, just in the context section? I can't see any questions yet, so please let me know, otherwise just interrupt. So climate change scenarios, I think it's really important to describe what climate change scenarios your organisation will be basing its decisions on. And climate change scenarios can be a range of things. So they can be the physical climate change scenarios around the hazards, and I'll get to that in a minute, or they can be what is termed a transition risk. So what are the carbon price, what are the carbon mitigation mechanisms, what regulations will you be tracking? So developing scenarios and stress testing against those scenarios is really important. But once again, I advocate within a policy, you will express what's the minimum information that you will be including in your climate change scenarios, and what time period are you looking at? So it's really important to say, well, it's easy to say climate change scenario, but are you looking at 2030, 2050, 2070 or beyond? New Zealand is a good example. They have to go beyond 2100 because of their planning legislation. The Resource Management Act says they must plan 100 years into the future. So for them, that is going out to 2120, sorry. And because I can't see the, Steve, just on the admin side of thing, or Joe, if some of you can just keep an eye on the questions, because I can't see those pop up. So just interrupt if you think we need to have a question. I can see a couple of things pop up there on the screen. Critically, where will you get your information from? So, often I survey local governments and I ask them, what are you basing your decision making on? And some of them are just saying, oh, I just want to, surprisingly, some still to this day say, oh, I use the media, or I just do a Google search. And so, it's important to say, let's say if you were in Australia, you might say, we are going to use, the climate change modelling presented by, the CSIRO, which is the government science body, as a minimum. We're open to having any other information be tabled for us. In New Zealand, it would be NIWA. You might say, it's information from the IPCC. And then the other thing to consider is, what would you be using for quantification? So like, are you going to look at dollars, and are you going to have a discount rate when you're doing any economic analysis? Sorry about that. So let's look at some physical climate change scenarios. So of course we are aware of climate change hazards in terms of those physical risks. So it might be temperature. There's a plethora of variables. And so sometimes a council or an organisation may decide to actually list the climate change variables that they, as a minimum, think they should be looking at. There are different ways of doing it, but I think the important thing to recognise is that there's a significant list of variables here. You know, if you look at it, you've got mean temperature, maximum temperature, you've got pan evaporation, but you've also got these in increments. You could have hourly, you could have daily, you could have monthly, seasonally. And so this information is actually important to start mapping out what, as an organisation, are you going to look at? What do you think you have sensitivity or are vulnerable to? Some organisations, and I'll jump to this in a moment, have actually created their own guidelines for climate change. So the policy, all the policy would state is that council uses the climate change guideline technical document for its decision making around, you know, choosing climate scenarios, and then they create their own active document in that space. And the reason for this is some of the complexities that you get around climate change. You know, there's 60 or 70 climate change models. There's different downscaling methodologies. There's pattern scaling, dynamic downscaling, statistical downscaling, just to name the three main ones. And then you also have a range of climate change, you know, pathways. And so this example here is just for the same date, the same time period, going up to 2019, say for New Zealand. But what I did is I looked at different climate change model outputs, and you can see that depending on which model output you are choosing, you can actually get quite a different result. And that's why it's, once again, really important, because you can actually game this, you know, and if you could selectively choose what data you're wanting to use. And most people don't understand the fact that there are these different climate change models. There are different types of outputs. Some are better suited for certain locations. And so, you know, a good example for a policy might say, we will use RCP 8.5 physical climate change models for these time periods, and the models will be the 50th percentile of an ensemble of all of the climate change models. So it's just really important they explicitly state what you're doing. Or you may say, look, we're open to the whole range, but that would need to be stated. And I think that could get quite complex. Okay. So as I said before, so some councils actually refer to local technical guidelines. And so a good example of that is in Tasmania. So they got their local science organisation, the Antarctic Centre of Excellence. And what they did is they created local climate change profiles for each municipality. And it's just, you know, 3 or 4 pages. And the some of the councils actually in their policies just said, this is you know, what we will refer to as this climate change technical guideline. Other councils actually explicitly have actually embedded the statement into their policy document. So they'll say, you know, council, for this example, we use a minimum IPCC 8.5, the RCP 8.5, and as a minimum include changes to the average and extreme annual and seasonal projections for 2030, 2050, 2070 and 2100. It's quite interesting. I did a project for a state agency, and they told me they wanted every single possible variable for every single climate change model for every single piece of time. And I told them that, you know, that would end up being 40,000 plus layers of information. They didn't quite realize that, you know, so once you start, you know, drilling down, there's so much information. So it's really important to sort of drill down what information you actually think is relevant. Additionally, other things for general scenarios or transition risk scenarios or cascading scenarios, what sort of future, what do you think the future world will be? What are the other mega trends that are out there? Insurance will be an interesting, you know, are you going to be in a world that is where insurance becomes less and less available, and how is your organisation going to respond to that? Of course, you might be thinking of things around food security, water security, energy security. Of course, health and pandemics is a really interesting one. if you ever want to scare yourself, the Swiss Re, the reinsurer, put out a really interesting publication last year, quite timely, called Pandemic Risk in a Changing Climate. So, you can really see how climate change is going to place significant stress on an organisation. So let's maybe just pause there and see if we've got some questions, because I noted there's a couple of things popped up. Steve, are there any questions?
Not seeing any yet.
No? Okay, I just saw a couple of them.
But there's actually a question I wanted to ask, which might help. I'll just see if I can switch my video on. Yeah. Yeah, look, you were talking about thinking hard about where you are going to get your information from and assistance with modelling and so on. So one question I've got is, have you seen good examples where local governments are partnering with universities or local research institutes? And associated with that, how far should we go? Because quite often with climate change, we're about 80% aware already of what's happening with climate change in our area, and how much modelling is going to be beneficial to understand that other 20% of detail?
Yeah, that's a really, really tough question, but an important question. So yes, I've seen lots of examples where local governments and state agencies and other government entities have teamed up with universities. A good example is the Whitsunday Regional Council. So they actually established a climate change innovation lab because they realised that they couldn't have all the answers to all of the questions that were emerging. So they knew that there were some risks, but they just didn't know what the risks were, or they didn't know what the answers were. So they wanted to set up an innovation lab. And they've signed MOUs and, with a number of the universities up there and also down in the sort of southeast Queensland region. So they drill down into specific examples. So I think one of the research things they're looking at the moment is looking at innovative finance for a municipality with public-private partnerships and adaptation. The other question that you asked, I think is really important, because most local governments don't have the capacity to go and do, a couple $100,000 worth of climate change modelling. There are tools out there, and there's a lot of publicly available tools where you can look at some climate change data. I think organisations need to go down into as much detail as they can afford and as they can understand, and often for local governments, this is where teaming up with local government, with universities or research organisations is important, because that 20%, those outliers that you're talking about might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So if you look at the municipality that I live in at the moment, the changes to average rainfall annually, if you just look at that real simplistically, there's plus or minus 5%. So you wouldn't think that you'd need to change and design your city much at all. But what it's looking like is that our extremes will be 30% more heavy, and and the hourly extremes might be up to 50% more heavy. So that has massive ramifications for our stormwater networks. So short answer is get as much as you can.
Get as much as you can. Thank you. We have one other question also from Farhan Helmi, who's a long-time friend of ICLEI based in Jakarta, or possibly in Bandung. And Farhan is asking, he remembers a few years ago in Indonesia and some other countries, ICLEI developed a planning guide for low emissions development strategies, and wondering what the connection is with this presentation today. And look, I think the answer, Farhan, is that ICLEI does have planning guides for climate change, and I was going to mention that at the very end of the session. However, we probably haven't dug as deeply into climate risk and risk assessment as you're hearing today. So we see that this approach from Informed.City being a very important additional layer to the more generic planning guide that we already have. Thanks, but let's hand back to Donovan now to go on to the next stage.
It's people moving. Actually, and one of the things I did want to note, though, if you look at that, the carbon price issue or the around mitigation, that is a scenario that probably should be considered. I actually will flip back just really quickly. Because there's a range of carbon prices out there, and carbon does present a material risk to local governments, and it presents a financial risk. And as 20% of the carbon that's out there at the moment does have a carbon price, and that's increasing significantly. But you need to have a range, of course. And the range that we created, I think, for one of our clients, here for out 2050, ranged from about $120 to, I think, $280 or so. But there are climate variables out there that are much higher than that. So, for example, Standard & Poor's, the global credit rating agency, for 2050, one of their outlier prices on carbon, they use $2,500, I think. So, they see that is possible. So then the next thing is governance. And so within the climate change policy, actually, explicitly state what governance mechanisms will climate change be fed into. And for those of you that didn't attend the session last week, my argument is that it should be in most of your climate change, most of your formal mechanisms. So if you've got a corporate plan or a council plan, that's the one that sort of sets the scene for the organisational direction, then it should be in there. It needs to be in your long-term financial management plans. I think that it's critical that it's on the public risk register. It's on your internal risk register. Not too often it's not, but it definitely needs to be there, and it should be on a public risk register as well. It needs to be in your asset management plan. Once again, too often I see that climate change isn't considered in the asset management plans, and for many organisations, this represents a significant financial risk to the organisation. Land use planning, disaster management. I've just got greenhouse gas emissions. That's the formal sort of greenhouse gas reduction strategy, for want of a better word. Risk management mechanisms, your formal risk management framework. When you're looking at the likelihood and consequences, you need to start mapping out what does that mean with a climate change risk lens in that. Adaptation planning, and then what we're looking at today is actually having that climate change policy. So for those of you that weren't here last week, these are the sort of 10 indicators that we've assessed over 400 organisations to see, to what extent are they considering climate change in each of those key components. And then for the other thing I think is what's important for governance is to work out what is your pathway for internal reporting. So, there's two things. There's disclosure, which is public facing, and then there's reporting, your internal reporting. How often are you going to do that? So, are you going to present to the executive team every 3 months, or is it something that you've got a dashboard so you're tracking, on a daily basis? Additional elements that you could put that I have seen in some of the climate change policies that I've been involved in. It's, how often and what processes will be used for community engagement, and whereabouts on that sort of, ladder of participation is council wanting to engage the community. So is it anywhere from just letting people know and informing through to participatory democracy, where people are voting on different adaptation actions. What are the cultural considerations? And also, importantly, make sure that it's in your procurement systems. Any questions on the governance side of things?
It doesn't look like there are any questions yet, Donovan, so maybe keep...
Okay, fantastic. So the next one's on capability and capacity. And what that's about is just to understand, what is the capability of your staff and the capacity of your organisation to respond to climate change. Some councils that I know actually have an annual climate change survey. That's something that we've done. We've done it for, I think we've had probably about 4,000 staff now fill out, different survey results. But that's really important. Sending out a survey each year just to ask your employees, their understanding and what the barriers and the enablers are for them, for the organisation, will give you that overview of understanding the actual departmental issues. So sometimes some councils think they're really across it because they've got a proactive environment officer that's doing really well, where at the same time the chief financial officer knows nothing about climate change, doesn't understand how they're going to take the information from the environment officer and put it into their reporting framework. And so it's really important to get an understanding. And I use that example of the chief financial officer because that is usually one that is a significant issue. Then if you can establish an internal working group, what is the makeup of that group is going to be? So a policy is a good place to put that in, saying, you know, we're going to have a climate change working group, an internal working group. It's going to meet every 3 months, and it has to have a representative of each department that meets, and will meet for at least, say, 2 hours or something like that, you know, just to make sure you break down some of those silos. And importantly, you know, who are those key networks and those key external stakeholders that you may decide on bringing into the conversation, whether it be the working group or further afield. Then, of course, resourcing is really critical. So often we get a lot of statements around climate change, but no follow up with the funds, you know, and resourcing is actually really, really important. So if your organisation doesn't have the money or doesn't have the funds, then work out how much you need and justify why you need it, you know, through your climate policy and an assessment of different governance mechanisms. So then you can go out and ask potentially donor, you know, agencies. And then I think I actively encourage organisations to do is just create what they determine to be a suitably qualified climate change expert, because you know, climate change is a really interesting space. I've been working in climate change adaptation for almost 20 years now, and I'm seeing more and more people hang up their shingle to say that they're a climate change expert or a climate change consultant, and it's really important that, you know, you understand how, you know, what level of expertise does this climate change consultant have, and by having, you know, certain forms for them to fill out. I've worked with organisations that have created special forms to make sure that any consultant that advises them on climate change meets the minimum consideration, and usually that's to protect themselves because of insurance requirements as well. So I've seen a lot of the fine print for insurance contracts. The insurer will say something to words to effect. They'll say, you're covered for, you know, climate related risks as long as a suitably qualified person was making a decision. And for climate change, it's not black and white like it is, say, for an engineering, where there's a peak association. Say, you know, for engineers or planners, climate change is still in the embryonic stages of I guess peak body space. Any questions around capability and capacity around that section? Nothing yet?
Again, I'd like to just jump in briefly, Donovan.
Sure.
If you don't mind. I think this last section is particularly important, and one thing that we find a lot in Italy working with cities is the need to get a very high level commitment to this work early, because to get the right people in those working groups and the right resources to do this job properly, what we don't want to see is that it's marginalised to one small section of the city administration. And that's why the tool that you showed us last week, the high level desktop assessment of a city's commitment, can be a very good start to getting senior managers 100% engaged in this process. And then the working groups will have high capacity and real teeth, and the results will be embedded into all of the city plans.
That's right. And what we find is that, you know, usually once you have those working groups, you know, each organisation have really skilled people within their organisation that come up with some really interesting solutions, and it sort of brings those people together. But too often, you're absolutely right, Steve, I see it sit, you know, in the back corner, usually with the environment officer, who traditionally doesn't get as much weight at the decision-making table. So I think it's a really good point. The next one's around monitoring and review, and I think that this is really, really important, and it's important to establish this up front. So if in your climate change policy, you need to record what are the minimum things that you want to be tracking. So what are the metrics? What are the key performance indicators? So your indicator needs to be relevant, of course. And, so it might mean something like how many residential properties are exposed to sea level rise, or to sea level in 2050 or 2070 or 2100. And then you can track that over time. And if that's growing, then you know that one of two things is happening. So one is that you're still approving development in at-risk locations, so you've got to actually have a look at your development assessment process, or the other one is that the sea level rise projection is getting bigger and bigger, or it could be a mixture of both. But the indicators, I often say, don't overdo it. You can kind of kill yourself with the death of data. Just pick things that are familiar, at least to start with, especially when you're talking to elected members or the community. So you might have 5 or 10 key things that you want to track over time. Of course, having reliable information is really, really important. And make sure that you are, if you're going to put indicators out there, make sure that you actually do update and track it over time. So once again, this is the issue of resourcing the problem. I've seen some really good baseline indicators, be tabled in some reports, but then they've never been revisited again, so 15 years later. I think about financial and non-financial components that you want to report on or publicly disclose. So, different things mean, are different to different people. So, of course, financial components are important for the audits. And more often now we see in Australia, the audit committees are actually asking the questions of the chief financial officer or about, how is climate change going to impact on the organisation. But of course, with governments, you're also looking at a whole range of things that's non-financial, and you're looking at different sort of time frames. So you might be looking at social justice issues and stuff. So what are the things that you want to be tracking over time? When you're looking at your own assets, so LGA, I'm referring to local government area assets, sorry about the abbreviation there. So, it might be, if you look at your, let's say roads, for example, you might be saying, well, okay, how many kilometres of road are exposed to X type of hazard, like let's say it's sea level rise, and what is the value of that? And is it replacement value? So in your policy, you might be saying, we have to disclose everything in the replacement value, or we have to have a damage curve and it has to have a discount rate. Things to keep an eye on are things about any risk to the potential income streams for municipalities. So there are a lot of conversations on at the moment around local government bonds being affected, city bonds or municipal bonds in the US at risk from climate change. And so councils have to start thinking about different revenue streams to deal with this this issue. And last but not least, there is when do you actually review? And I'll come back to the review timelines in a minute. But of course, it's important to set a baseline or multiple baselines. Usually a baseline set on the year that you've got data. So it might be, you might say, this is our baseline. We've got 500 homes in our municipality exposed to sea level rise, and our key performance indicator is that we will have no more homes exposed to sea level rise from this day forward, or no more than 5%, or whatever your risk appetite is. But make sure that you've got systems in place and that you recognize that information and data is actually a critical piece of infrastructure. And so you recognize that, and that's really important. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult. And I'm always an advocate for data visualization, because it's an easier way of disclosing information and reporting information. And, a picture says 1,000 words. This is an example of one municipality who we were working with, but they were tracking their climate change governance over time. This is down in Tasmania, and you can see they sort of improved over sort of a 3-year period. That's Kingborough Council. And as I mentioned before around review points for your policy, so most organisations, if they're creating a policy or a corporate standard, they might have their set review time. So it might say, this policy will be reviewed within 2 years, or in 2 years' time, or 5 years' time. As well as that, I think it's important to have triggers for review, just because climate change is moving so quickly. So one example that I've seen is the IPCC assessment report. So the next one that's coming out is AR6, Assessment Report 6. And I know that one council has said, we will review all our policies within 6 months of the next assessment report. So, you know, pegging it to that sort of 5 or 6 year time frame when the AR reports come out. Or another trigger for review might be litigation. It might be litigation against your own organisation, or it might be when a precedent is set. So that might be a mechanism for it. Another one might be regulatory change. It might be market triggers. So if your organisation has trouble getting finance, or your community is getting trouble getting finance, say lending because of a climate related risk, then that might be a point for you to review your policy to see if you can tweak it to overcome those issues. Or if you get multiple events or a significant extreme event, let's say that's outside that 1% return rate. A good example of that is I was doing a project on the mid-north coast of New South Wales with one location who some of the elected members didn't really believe in climate change. This was about 10 years ago. And in the 6 weeks that I was working with them, they had 4 1% events, 4 1 in 100 year events occur, flooding events occur at that time. So my argument would be they're probably no longer classed as a 1% event. And then of course you also might need to review it after the findings of an audit. Are there any questions about monitoring and review? We're almost through this process, and then we can open it up for broader questions.
Keep going, thanks. Yes.
So this last one is around disclosure and reporting. So often people look at disclosure and they get really fearful of it. They think it's, you know, airing our dirty laundry. You know, they're just a bit nervous about putting everything on the table. But I always remind, especially the government clients, that, you know, you're using taxpayers' money, and, you know, transparency is actually kind of the minimum you should be doing. But there is this, you know, sensitivity. Very few elected members want to put transformational change on one of their key performance indicators because it involves a bit of a shake-up. It can be complex. But for reporting, I think within your policy setting, you should be stating how often are you going to be reporting, and who are you going to be internally reporting, and how often are you going to be disclosing. So is your climate change disclosure, what are the components of that climate change disclosure look like? And is it going to be always out there for the community to look at, or are you only going to release it every quarter or every year or so? So it's really important that you actually just state that within the policy, and how often are you going to have an audit of your disclosure and your reporting mechanisms. So we're at the end of the presentation, but I think hopefully just in this very short time that we had, you know, I've managed to help encourage you to see that, you know, a climate change policy does help establish those formal and consistent responses. And when you're actually looking at a climate change policy, that can help you frame the things that you need to look at actually for a climate change strategy. Actually can help unpack everything that you need. I would argue that you should create a climate change policy before you do a climate change strategy or any other climate change response. It doesn't need to be big, but it needs to be formally endorsed. And what I've seen for a few municipalities and government organisations is they create the policy, and the policy says, the policy itself might only be reviewed every 2 years or so, but what they say, they give the head of power to a strategy. So they might say the head of power for the strategy that gets created is going to be the formal document that council makes its decisions on. The minimum amount of information that goes into a strategy should be X, Y, and Z, and they keep it really brief. So I've seen policies that are 10 pages, I've seen policies that are 2 pages, and then they refer back to the strategy themselves. So we've got 7 minutes or so for a conversation and for any questions, and hopefully there's some. I'm interested in seeing what people in the room have, and if anyone else actually has a climate change policy, or if they're thinking of creating one, or if there are just general questions.
Thanks, Donovan. What I'd suggest is I'd like to hand over to our manager of the Global Covenant of Mayors, Sally Moxon, for a couple of minutes, just to talk about where people can follow up on some of this. And if we do that now, that'll give the participants a few minutes to put questions into the chat box. So Sally is based in the ICLEI office in Melbourne. She's our Manager of Strategy and Partnerships for the Global Covenant of Mayors. And that's one reason why we're providing these sessions. So over to Sally. Where can people go if they would like some more help?
Hello, everybody. Yeah, absolutely come and contact us at ICLEI. So a useful email to remember is oceania@iclei.org. You can send any questions or any queries you might have. I'll just take a moment to point out that one of the key programs that ICLEI run is the Global Covenant of Mayors in the Oceania region. And that's the international program for local government. It's an environmental program that focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from local government community and climate adaptation. And there's over 10,000 councils across the world part of that program. And how's that relevant to this presentation? Well, one of the goals of the Global Covenant of Mayors is to support councils in developing a climate adaptation plan that does a risk analysis, that develops a strategy, and importantly, puts in place key performance indicators. And everything that you've heard in this presentation supports that goal. And these kinds of plans and risk analysis also are complementary and dovetail nicely with any kind of state, regional or national jurisdictional requirements that you might have in your country. So it's designed that it's complementary, not additional. So yeah, just any questions on that, please send them through. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sally. And as we said at the start, we see this particular approach and the work that Informed Cities does as a very important resource. As you've heard, Donovan's worked mainly in Australia and New Zealand doing this climate risk work, but we believe this could have application almost anywhere else in the world. And through our ICLEI international network, if there's interest from another country, from local authorities in another country, to have a look at the tool and to see whether they could use it, we'd be very happy to work with you and to introduce you to Donovan. I'm not seeing any other questions yet. There's an awful lot of content in what you went through, Donovan, and certainly the climate planning guides that ICLEI develops, quite often it's a 1 or 2 year process for a city to do that properly. So it's fairly difficult to get our heads around it so quickly. But I think one of the key points you made right at the end is before a city develops a fully detailed climate action plan, the full set of actions and strategies they're going to pursue, recommending that they have a high level policy first to give the framing. I think that's a very critical point that you've made.
Yeah, I think it just sets the rules of the game, you know, and too often organisations dive into it without understanding who does what or what the limitations are. And I think by just taking a bit of a breath, having a look at, you know, a policy, get that head of power, get that, you know, something you can hang your hat on as an organisation. It doesn't have to be big, and you can do it, you know, really, really quickly. Probably will save you countless hours, you know, or days, or money later on, because you're starting to understand the things that you need around the implementation side of things. Because once again, we see that whilst there's significant interest in creating a climate change plan or strategy, the devil's in the detail, and also the devil's in the implementation. And as we are aware that we're running out of time for implementation, both for adaptation and mitigation strategies, it's coming on rather fast.
An interesting question in the chat box, maybe you could have a look at it, from Yangbo Du, about the 2000 watt society concept. Yangbo, would you like to speak to that for a moment? We can switch on your microphone and camera if you'd like to discuss that.
Yes, so it was announced about a decade ago, the 2000 Watt Society, and what they tried doing was they ran a couple of scenarios, and what they developed was a means of figuring what would be the highest material consumption, so what would be a level where everyone can maintain a high standard of living, all 10 billion around the world, without exceeding any sort of ecological constraints. And what they figured was that if you were to average it out around the 10 billion population, then that's equivalent to 2000 watts of continuous power capacity, which includes embodied energy in materials and services, and no more than 1 ton per year per capita CO2, which is actually quite consistent with reducing gross emissions from current levels by 80%, or zeroing out net emissions by 2050 or 2060. So that was what they developed, and that was also, and also what they found was that by cutting material consumption, what wasn't quite expected was that it, with these constraints, it actually led to higher quality of life in their scenario planning. So that's just a way also to be able to make the case, deliver the political will for such action, is telling that this will actually be an improvement. This is not really any form of a sacrifice, for instance. So that's just some context about it.
Yeah, great, very interesting. And as you say, it's a way to really obtain the commitment from city leaders once they look at research like this. Donovan, care to comment on that?
Sorry, rookie mistake there. I was just quickly flipped through it when Du was talking about it. It's really interesting because I saw that there were actually mechanisms within the municipal code, referring back to that. I guess I'm interested in, that was a decade ago, to see how that actually has manifested. But I'm not aware of it. I think it's a really interesting approach to take, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, just having a look to see whether there are any further questions. We're up to the hour, but we could go a couple of minutes past if we need to. Meantime, let me do a quick advertisement for the Daring Cities program. It ain't over yet. We have 3 more days, and if you'd like to go onto the Daring Cities website, you can see the program for the rest of today and for tomorrow and for Wednesday. So please do have a look at what's coming up. You can see a recording of this session or any other sessions if you go onto the website. There will be a delay of several days before they're all up online. And particularly if you found today interesting, you might like to go back and have a look at last Monday's part 1 of this series, just to see the sort of approach that we're recommending. As Sally said, we see this as a critical piece of work which can be used by cities that have signed up to the Global Covenant of Mayors. And ICLEI globally has a planning guide called the Green Climate Cities, which helps a city to understand all of its risks, both from the point of view of emissions and climate impacts. And as we said before, this particular piece of work today almost adds another layer, particularly in identifying risk and building it into your underpinning policies. So I see no more chats. So look, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and it's very interesting. Everyone stayed on for the entire time. So there you go, Donovan.
That's always useful. Thanks for that.
It's been interesting and useful. Thank you very much to Donovan for all the work. Thank you to Joseph, who's sitting quietly in his office in Bonn, anchoring this session. And we hope that you will join another Daring Cities session in the next few days. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.